In this section, we're going to introduce to you something that will help us get past this little strange negative sign that sometimes it pops up inside a radical. So I want to give you a definition that when we see -1, that we're going to use a variable or a designation for it. It's not really a variable, but I, just to represent it being an imaginary number. And it's not really imaginary, it's just the name that kind of stuck with that we gave to it a long time ago. And then if I squared both sides, -1 equals I squared. So this is going to help us proceed on some of our problems where we find solutions and the solutions have imaginary roots or imaginary solutions. So let's get an idea what this means. Say for example I have the square root of -9. Well, that's going to be the square root, and the thing I like to do is break down all the factors inside that I can. So this can be the square root of -1 times the square root of 9. Break that apart, so the square root of -1 and the square root of 9. The square root of -1 we determined, we're going to call that I. And the square root of 9 is a 3. And then typically people like to put the 3 first and the I second. So I was able to deal with the square root of -9. I can't reduce it down just using real numbers. I have to use some imaginary numbers. And the designation we're using is I to stand for the square root of -1. Let's look at another example. The square root of -3. Well, before we just said it was undefined. We can't do anything about it. But now I'm going to realize there's a -1 in there. And with that -1, I can pop that out. So that's going to be an I with a square root of 3 left over. Square root of 3 stays inside. Can't do anything with that. But that -1, I can pull that out because the square root of -1 is I. And the last example I want to show you to kind of get us going. The square root of -80. Well, this one's going to add a couple of components that we've been learning. I have a -1 in there. And I want to factor 80 down. I'm hoping that I can reduce that somehow. So what I need to do is take all the factors of 80 and choose the one that has its highest perfect square in it. Perfect squares are 4, 9, 16, 25, 64. Which of those are perfect squares that are also factors of 80? Well, 80 is 16 times 5. So now I can see some perfect squares. -1, the square root of -1 is an I. The square root of 16 is a 4. And the square root of 5 is the square root of 5. So the square root of -80 can be reduced and simplified down to 4I root 5.